7, 6, 5. 4-stage engine start. 3, 2, 1, and liftoff.
We close with good night, good luck, and God bless all of you on the good earth.
Welcome to Next Giant Leap, a podcast from GZERO's Blue Circle studio and produced in partnership with MDA Space. I'm Mike Massimino, Columbia engineering professor and former NASA astronaut.
And I'm Mike Greenley, CEO of MDA Space, a global leader in communication satellites, Earth and space observation, and space exploration and infrastructure.
In 1957, the Soviet Union accomplished a technological first. They launched a shining silver sphere called Sputnik 1 into Earth's orbit. Sputnik's success jolted the world into a new era of geopolitical rivalry as Russia and the United States competed for dominance over the sky. This became known as the space race. Nearly 7 decades later, space technology is almost unrecognizable. Thousands of satellites have been launched into orbit. 6 different rovers have traversed the surface of Mars. And the revolutionary James Webb Space Telescope has expanded our understanding of the universe by leaps and bounds. As our knowledge and abilities continue to expand, space is once again on the forefront of geopolitics. Who will be the first to have citizens live on the moon? Who will be the first to plant their flag on Mars? And how will those advantages translate into power here on Earth?
Today, we're diving into why space is so critical to national security, how global powers like the US and China are shaping the modern space race, and why this is one of the driving geopolitical narratives of the 21st century.
Mike, why do you think there's renewed interest in space and security right now?
Well, I think that there's renewed interest in space because there's an increasingly accessible and growing space economy. And so as a result, we have more and more nations that are interested in participating in space. Back in the days when we started the space station, there were 6 countries, I think, that had a space agency. And now there's 90 countries with a space agency. Businesses are putting up constellations to observe the Earth and deliver communications, and there's private space stations now. So you've got all this increased commercial activity. That increased commercial activity seems to be causing increased competitiveness between companies, but then increased competitiveness between nations. And as a result of that, we end up with increased military activity. So now commercial enterprises, in addition to government enterprises in space, have very interested counterparties. So there's increased need to be able to secure your activities in space and secure the activities in space that are supporting activities on Earth.
Did you see this coming, Mike, at some point? Did you say, all right, like 10, 15 years ago, did you say, all right, this is where we're headed? Because I had no idea, especially the private enterprise part of it, I had no idea this would ever grow to the way it's had. What were you thinking way back then?
I think over the last 10 years, you could feel it. I would say for me, it's the last 10 years, but mathematically in our business, the last 5 years, it shows up in the results. Since 2021, we doubled in size. By 2023, then we doubled in size again for 2025. Like every 2 years, we're doubling. So this last 5 years, I feel that, the space market became uncorked and people just really started to take off in economic activity. And those of us that have been cruising along for a decade or two, now all of a sudden you're launched, you're taking off in your growth. And so it's really showing up in the last 5 years.
Well, thanks, Mike. Really appreciate your insights. It's going to be interesting to see how things go in the next couple of years here. But we are now going to welcome 2 distinguished guests who've devoted much of their careers to understanding the issues we're discussing today. Jane Harman served 9 terms in Congress, representing Southern California's aerospace corridor, and is a leading national security expert with deep ties to U.S. space policy. She currently sits on the NASA Advisory Council, co-chaired a 2025 Council on Foreign Relations Task Force on Securing Space, and previously chaired the Commission on the National Defense Strategy. And Dean Cheng is a non-resident fellow at George Washington University's Space Policy Institute and a senior fellow at the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies. specializing in the U.S. relationship with China. He also served as a senior research fellow at the Heritage Foundation, as well as a senior advisor to the China program at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Thanks to you both for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
And let's start with you, Congresswoman Harman. You are the representative for the 36th Congressional District in California, the hub of the aerospace industry. From your perspective, how has the role of space as a national priority for the United States evolved over the past decade?
Well, thank you for including me in the broadcast. And I'm looking at three people who are far more expert than I, but I did pay my dues. I did represent what I used to call the Aerospace Center of the Universe for 17 years and counting in the United States Congress. And let me just back up 3 decades, because that's when I was elected in the 90s. And when I was elected in 1992, the Cold War had just ended. And the view of the United States, starting with the George H.W. Bush administration, was we won, they lost, everyone wants to be us. We can now downsize our procurement budgets for defense and space, etc. And we did. And so when I won my election to Congress, the area was a ghost town. The triple PhDs who had won the Cold War were getting out of work notices. They were told, we don't need you anymore because we don't have the procurement needs. Well, that seemed to me at the time to be ill-advised. It wasn't clear to me it was a less dangerous world, and it turned out not to be. But my point in telling you this is the decade of the 90s was a build-back decade, and we basically worked on dual-use technologies to help regrow our space industry. It never occurred to me then that we would end up with what we have now. But among other things was a visit to a constituent of mine named Elon Musk, who invited me to come see him in his rental rocket factory with sawdust on the floor. And he said, I'm building these rockets with Russian technology, and I want to sell them to the Pentagon. Can you help? And I remember thinking, what? Yeah, sure, kid. You're going to make a real go of this. Well, it shows what I know about space, or Elon Musk for that matter. But he has obviously built the behemoth space company, SpaceX. And just to answer about the last decade, the industry's unrecognizable. It's not just because the private sector grew space. It's because we figured out that in security terms, we absolutely have to have space. The U.S. is the biggest user of space for national security, and we're the most vulnerable in space in terms of national security. So we've got to get this right, or we, it seems to me, will not only lose more ground, I'm sure Dean will say this, to China, but lose to China.
Do you think we're heading in the right direction there? Is it becoming more of a national priority, do you think, over the past couple of years?
It needs to become more of a national priority. I think it was underinvested in every sense in the Biden administration, and I still don't see signs other than SpaceX all over the place that we're going to do some of the things that this Council on Space Policy Management that I co-chaired has recommended.
We started out this episode talking about the historic race between the U.S. and Russia. But the truth is today, the real rivalry is between the United States and China. Dean, in your opinion, how does China, now a major spacefaring nation, view the role of space in its national security strategy?
So on the one hand, the Chinese recognize that space touches every piece of what they term comprehensive national power. It touches military power, that's obvious. It touches economic power. From the Chinese perspective, space is what helps encourage things like systems integration and systems engineering. Those are incredibly important skills that have benefits across a nation's entire industrial sector. You want to build airliners, you want to build telecoms, 5G networks. All of that is about systems integration and systems engineering. It touches on China's diplomacy. They have been very effective at using the sale of satellites to build relations. It builds domestic support. From the Chinese perspective, space is a great way of demonstrating that China is no longer the sick man of Asia. The China of today is the number 2, in some ways maybe even the number 1 space power. Compare that to 1957 at the dawn of the space age, when China couldn't even make a single airliner. So space is incredibly important. But at the same time, from the Chinese perspective, we are living in the information age. So what matters about space is not how many satellites do you have. how many rockets you have. Those are nice numbers that people can throw up to sort of say who's ahead and who's behind. From the Chinese perspective, what really matters is information. And space matters because that's how you collect information, how you move information, how you exploit information. So if you have space dominance, which the Chinese say explicitly they want to do, then you are well on the path to information dominance. Without space dominance, you can still achieve a lot of advances in information technologies as information dominance, but it's a lot harder. So it's not about, wow, how many satellites? Well, we have more satellites than they do, so we're clearly winning. Or our satellites are more sophisticated than theirs. Obviously, we're winning. From the Chinese perspective, yeah, if I can, for example, build a supercomputer in space so I don't have to beam stuff down for data processing, that's what matters.
It's interesting, this word dominance that you use. And, we talk a lot about, sort of generally keeping score a little bit in terms of like the China catching up with the U.S. and in whatever way you want to measure it from a space perspective. And lately I've been spending a fair amount of time on the space economy. And I noticed that in the Western world estimates, we talk about the global space economy today being about $500, $600 billion a year, on its way to a 2035, 2040 estimate of about $1.8 trillion a year. But when I read the literature out of China on the Earth to Moon economic zone, they use a number of $10 trillion a year in 2050. So, they're chasing a prize that's 10 times as big in their own minds, and therefore they're going to invest in something that's 10 times as big or lean into something that's 10 times as big, which must drive them in this effort towards dominance as well. Would you think that makes sense?
Yes, absolutely. So interesting about the Earth-Moon economic zone. One of the most important things about this entire region, this entire zone, is, again, not about numbers. What will be the language of space traffic management? Imagine you go from Barcelona to Bangkok, two countries where English is not the native language. From the moment you take off till the moment you land, and every time your plane is handed off to air traffic control, the language in the cockpit, the language with the ground control centers is English. Doesn't matter what the language of the country that you're flying over is. Why? Because when the rules were being set, the United States was the largest user of civil aviation. The Chinese have made very clear, that's fine, you go ahead. When you fly and you leave the GeoBelt and you go on your way to the moon or to Mars, you're going to be speaking Chinese because we are going to dominate the spaceways. There will be Chinese on the moon. There will be Chinese spacecraft coming back and forth. There will be more Chinese spacecraft. And this is where numbers do matter. If there are twice as many Chinese citizens on the moon, if there are twice as many missions into lunar orbit, why would the language be English?
Right.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I think we're at a moment where the U.S. is losing our leverage as the leader, rule setter in the world. And I think some of that has been deliberate decisions by various administrations to pull out of certain things. But I think some of it also is owed to Chinese persistence, about which I know much less than Dean does. But nonetheless, they have a command economy, and they are determined to lead in a variety of ways. I mean, information dominance got that. But I also think defense dominance, watching how they're pulling ahead. Their industrial base is eating our lunch. And that's a deliberate decision. And I think we have a lot of catching up to do. They use all elements of national power. It's not just military might. It is certainly tech-based dominance. It's friends and allies. It's soft power. And they see, and we should see, space as an instrument of soft power. It's an amazingly important instrument that we are underutilizing.
In your recent Council on Foreign Relations report, Congresswoman, you highlight the risks of China ramping up its space capabilities, but also recommend that the U.S.-China set up a bit of a direct hotline communication channels.
Yeah.
Why is this kind of strategic engagement so important, do you feel?
Well, there's a huge danger. It doesn't just apply in space, of miscalculation. Another place it applies is in cybersecurity. I mean, if the Chinese think we're attacking them in space or in some technical way, they're going to respond. And if instead there's a hotline where President X of the U.S. calls President Y of China and says, oops, you're misunderstanding this, or this is fake news or disinformation or misinformation, this is not happening, I think that's a crucial thing that we need to have. And at the moment, we don't have a hotline in space.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to very respectfully disagree with the Congresswoman.
That's the great point of a podcast. Fire away.
As a foreign colleague once observed, for the Chinese, hotlines only work so long as they stay cold. We have hotlines with the Chinese, not on cyber, not on space, but in a variety of other areas. The simple reality is the Chinese don't pick up. We have called them during crises. The Chinese don't pick up. The Chinese precipitate crises, and they certainly don't pick up. On the issue of miscalculation, the FBI, CISA, and others have come out with official assessments about something called Volt Typhoon. Volt Typhoon is the name of what is attributed to the Chinese state, not just a bunch of criminal hackers, but government people who have emplaced malware in critical infrastructure in the United States: power, water, telecommunications, energy, transportation. It would not surprise me if it was present in space systems. What exactly is it that we're supposed to cooperate with? Hey, we found your stuff? Or is it instead, well, you've installed terrible things. Did you know about this? And I think the answer there is, like any good leader caught with their hand in the cookie jar, of course they won't accept that they know it. But this is what we are talking about here is, for crisis stability, it's a great idea to have that hotline. Certainly after the Cuban Missile Crisis, we used the hotline with the Soviets. They picked up, by the way, and so did we. But with the Chinese, we have a very different culture, a very different political system. It may be communist, but it's not Soviet. And most importantly, we have a system that seems to have a very scarily different view of crisis management. And the willingness to install malware in our critical infrastructure should be a very, very big warning signal that this is not a country that operates the way our past adversaries have.
I couldn't agree more, but let's not assume that we have what's called in the law biz, and I am a lapsed lawyer, clean hands either. I mean, we have robust intelligence trying to find out what's happening against us, and let's understand how vulnerable our critical infrastructure is and that the Chinese are there. I mean, just think ports of LA and Long Beach. 50% of the container traffic in the world passes through those ports. There are cranes everywhere to unload the containers. Guess who makes the cranes? Hello, China. So those places are already vulnerable. And yes, we should not assume clean hands on the part of the Chinese or us, I would say, but we should be pretty sober about this. And it does seem to me that the Cuban Missile Crisis is a very good historical fact where we avoided nuclear war because we actually talked. And I would like to avoid not just nuclear war, but any form of massive space-based attack, which could be commercial, doesn't always have to be a defense attack, if we can try to talk to each other.
Mike G., let me pull you in here. How do you see the private sector contributing to national security in space? Like, what role should private companies play in working with governments and other organizations to protect the country's interests in the space domain?
Yeah, it'll evolve. What role should they play? But it's certainly, there's definitely a role as we see it today. If we look at like the current activities in space, we've got communication networks in space, we've got Earth observation satellites in space, and then we've got, a space station that's owned and operated by, 5 different countries working together. But I think it's pretty interesting what happens next because, we know the International Space Station is going to go out of business in the next 5 years. And we've got, 3 or 4 different commercial space stations under development. They're going to offer services for astronauts and corporations to do science and corporations to do manufacturing in orbit. And then the generation next after that, we've got people flying demonstration missions in the next couple of years for power stations in orbit to be able to collect solar energy from the sun and bring power down to Earth. People will have different forms of manufacturing industrial parks in orbit. So critical infrastructure, which we would be used to on Earth, all that critical infrastructure will be operated in space, by commercial corporations again, but it'll be critical to sovereignty and security here on Earth. So I find that the commercial sector is in a unique situation from a security perspective in space, much more collaborative than we see on Earth. On Earth, industry sells the military their equipment, but in space, there's a very large increasing of working together to cause it. Even till we see now, there's these new, like in the United States, in Canada, and other countries, commercial integration cells where the leaders of industry will go into secure military space command centers on a regular basis and collaborate, because we're all operating the same assets, trying to keep track of what's going on and working together as a commercial government team to be able to provide and protect national security.
I completely agree with all of that, but let me point out a few things. First of all, back in the 90s, in another century, I'm 200 years old, so I was only 100 years old then, we had none of that. We were building these one-offs, these fabulously impressive satellites that would perform a function. I remember in one case, I'm not sure why this was, but the entire industry that makes stockings was tied up and being purchased for some aspect of one of these satellites. And we invested in these one-offs, and there was a single point of failure. And if one little widget was not working, the thing would collapse and millions of dollars of federal investment would be gone. Now, the private sector provides, it seems to me, much more, if not most, of our space capability, even for military missions. And that's a good thing. So, space is so much more than anyone could have imagined just a few years ago.
This Houston, contact with a test 1. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
Dean, in your view, what does the current system of space law look like? Is it comprehensive enough, or how do you see that evolving?
Well, the current set of international laws is actually quite limited. It is basically rooted in the Outer Space Treaty and a handful of additional ones about liability, return of astronauts, etc. Every country has its own set of national laws governing their space conduct and their space behavior. And this actually brings us to a couple of different points that I want to bring up in this context about commercial. The first is that Starlink's behavior in Ukraine demonstrates that commercial players have gone from augmenting or supplementing to being strategic resources by themselves. The Ukrainians are not tapping into the U.S. military networks via Starlink. They are using Starlink directly for military activities. And what that means is that the entrepreneurs behind them and the companies behind them are strategic level assets. They don't have an American flag on a shoulder patch, but they are not that different from the old Strategic Air Command as an example of strategic power and strategic influence. But they aren't part of the government. And this raises issues of liability and indemnification. Can a company act in a conflict, maybe where our government isn't involved? What if that places its assets at risk? What does the SEC, what do shareholders say if you put $2 billion worth of this company's assets in jeopardy because Country Orange said, if you help Country Blue, we're going to shoot your satellites down? And finally, and this is perhaps one of the most difficult to understand aspects, is the Chinese concept of legal warfare. The Chinese military writings on legal warfare are very explicit. It has nothing to do with what is legal. It is about the use of law, treaty, regulation, courts, law enforcement agencies to achieve China's strategic goals. And so we should expect the Chinese to use the entire corpus of legal space-related laws, treaties, national laws, etc., to try and throw monkey wrenches into commercial companies helping us and raising questions about the legality of, and they have written articles already criticizing Starlink for violating international laws regarding neutrality, and then saying, look, under the current international legal regime, Starlink satellites are the responsibility of the launching state and the contracting state. So Washington, what are you guys doing? Are you still neutral? Because if you're not neutral, then you're a combatant in Ukraine. And that opens up all sorts of options for not us, the Chinese, but for the Russians. So these are the sorts of issues that no one had to deal with back in, say, World War II, because those merchant ships, they were flying an American or a British or a Russian flag. Today, that's a very different situation.
Mike, how much of a threat are space-based tensions to national security on the ground, do you think?
Well, the folks in government might have more of a view on that, but in my opinion, high. So we know that from our space businesses that we all depend on access to space multiple times a day in almost all the technology that we're using. It's being linked to and driven by space assets. That these combinations of corporations and countries that we've been discussing are providing communications terrestrially, which will even increase even more. And then the Earth observation every day is being provided by these companies and these governments. So just pure logic would tell you that one of your first, contact points in any major conflict or battle is going to be, in space. If you can turn off communications and observation and everything else in space quickly over an area of concern, then to deal with the national security on the ground as your secondary point. These are going to be highly interrelated things, and based on the conversation that we just had, it's not just government assets that are in play. It's going to be absolutely the engagement of corporate assets, which are providing, those communications and observational services to everybody. And the impact on activity on the ground is going to be extremely high. People's banking systems, navigation systems, information technology systems can all quickly get messed up. So, if you drop a bomb on a country and it blows up a building, that's one thing. If you take out a country's ability to do banking or navigate or have their communication signals, that can be a quick hit in space and have very dramatic effects to the interplay on the ground.
Well, one of the recommendations, again, of this CFR task force is to declare space critical infrastructure. And Ken Calvert, who's a Republican member of Congress from California, has a bill to do that. It's in the House. And if Congress were to do something important, just free suggestion, this might be one of the things to do because of what protection it would add. But I just want to point out that right now, thinking of the national security context, Ukraine launched a multi-faceted attack against Russian aircraft all through 11 time zones of Russia. And how do you think that was coordinated? How do you think those drones worked? Space is playing right now in war theaters, and there no doubt will be more of this around the world in the near future. So these issues could not be more profound, and we don't have any time to waste. And I think our government, the U.S. government, has been slow to recognize the priority that we need to give to space.
In that concept of slow, Congresswoman, like in general, how do people feel that the U.S. is prepared for potential conflict in space?
Well, you might ask Dean that, since he has a sort of darker view of where China is than I do, although I don't have a rosy view of where China is. But do people really understand this issue? Absolutely not. If they fully got it that, their cell phones might not work and their, banks would close and aircraft would collide, maybe that would get people's attention.
I can only point out that the United States is the only country that has decided to disarm in space. We are the ones who passed an executive-level decision not to test direct-descent anti-satellite weapons. The Russians haven't done that. In fact, they have tested them. The Chinese haven't done such a thing. They've tested them. The Indians have tested them. But we preen ourselves. Look at how immaculate I am. I would rather lose the next conflict than sully myself with using these icky anti-satellite weapons that might be important in establishing space dominance. I mean, you want to deny the Chinese the ability to do targeting. There's one other thing, by the way, just as long as we're on this, submarine cables. While absolutely communication satellites are important, right now I think 90% of data moves by cable. But as anyone who pays attention to that aspect will know, it is the Russians and Chinese who have this annoying habit of not just hovering over known cable locations, but in the Baltic and elsewhere have actually broken those cables.
Correct.
What happens then? You push your massive amount of bandwidth up to a much more limited amount of bandwidth in orbit, which can then be targeted by anti-satellite systems, including direct-descent ASAT weapons. Oh, sorry, those are icky. So that is the fundamental reality. They are testing, they are demonstrating the kind of operations to achieve information dominance in wartime, and we are preening ourselves and saying, oh, what a good boy or what a good girl I am.
Well, just to point out, the ASAT tests have been, so far as I know, conducted against their own satellites, not other satellites.
Yes.
I'm not saying that's adequate.
That's an act of war.
You noticed. Well, there are a lot of technically acts of war that we could call, but we don't sometimes. Space being only one domain. But I'm wondering whether some of the other stuff, I mean, satellites up there that spy on other satellites that kind of sort of crash into them. And these ASAT tests, by the way, generate a huge amount of space junk, which endangers everybody's satellites. So, I'm agreeing with you, Dean. This is getting closer and closer to catastrophe. And what is sound space policy? We're not having an adequate debate about this.
I would absolutely agree with you. The first thing we need to do is to have that debate to understand what our own domestic lefts and rights are, or what our own guardrails are, before we can start negotiating with the Chinese and the Russians and everybody else.
Dean, what's one space-related national security issue policymakers or the public are seriously underestimating right now?
The massive global political impact of when the Chinese land on the moon with people. Because one aspect of American uniqueness, we are the only country to have planted our flag on another celestial body, is going to go away. But what is truly worrisome beyond that is the fact that the Chinese launched a sample retrieval mission to Mars. They will be the first country to bring back samples from another planet. That used to be an American thing. We were the country of firsts. We were the countries that did it. And for the Chinese, you can be sure that when that thing lands somewhere in China and they open it up and bring out the rocks, there will be hoopla on a scale that and it will be global. It will be hammered. Diplomats, actors, academics, media will all be focused on that. And you can be sure that Xi Jinping is going to look at America and it's like, how you like them apples?
Congresswoman, if you were advising the U.S. political administrators, what's one space security priority that you would put on top of the list these days?
Well, I would say revive the Space Council. Let's start with that. Mike Pence, who's not a card-carrying Democrat to my knowledge, and who was the vice president in Trump 1, created the Space Council. And it was, for a while he was paying attention, a very robust entity. It kind of atrophied under the Biden administration. I'm an equal opportunity critic of our failure to focus enough on space. But I would revive that as we're revising the National Security Council, make it a key actor. The National Security Council is supposed to be, in the White House, the crucial advisor to our government on a variety of topics. So I'd revive that. And then I would review all of our space vulnerabilities. And I think, certainly our relationship with China needs enormous focus. Our relationship with China in broader defense terms needs enormous focus. Again, the opening sentence of this commission report been talking about was, in a possible war with China, the U.S. could lose. We didn't say would lose, could lose. So war includes the space domain, has to now, given where we are.
Right on. I don't know what you think, Mike, but I think this has been a great conversation. And starting off this next wave of this podcast, we've certainly set the stage for the import of space moving forward.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Mike. It's been fun. I want to thank our guests, Congresswoman Jane Harman, not only for doing this, but also as an astronaut, being kind of on the front line, putting myself on top of the rocket, knowing that we had leaders in Congress like you while I was serving as an astronaut that had our backs. I can't tell you how meaningful that was to all of us. So thank you on behalf of me and all my colleagues. And Dean Cheng, thank you very much. Your expertise was amazing. What a great conversation. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining Mike and I today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks very much to our listeners. I'm Mike Greenley from MDA Space.
And I'm Mike Massimino.
This is The Next Giant Leap. To hear more episodes from this series, subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts, or visit gzeromedia.com/next-giant-leap.
Next Giant Leap is produced by GZERO's Blue Circle Studios for MDA Space. To learn more about partnership opportunities with GZERO, head to gzeromedia.com/advertise.